She walked through that door at 3 a.m., and he was already waiting. J.P. Min didn't pace. Men who paced were men who were afraid, and J.P. Min had not been afraid of anything in 11 years. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his Manhattan penthouse, hands clasped behind his back, watching the city breathe 42 floors below him. Neon signs bled their colors into the wet pavement. Taxis honked. The world moved. He didn't. He just waited. And then the elevator doors opened. Carla stepped in like she owned the room because for 3 years she had. Her natural hair was pulled back just slightly, a few coils escaping around her temples like they always did when the night had been long. Her red dress caught the chandelier light and held it, the kind of red that doesn't ask for attention, it commands it. Her handbag was gripped in her right hand, knuckles just a shade too tight. Her chin was lifted, her eyes were steady. She was composed. She was too composed. And JP noticed everything. "You're late," he said. Not an accusation, a statement, low, measured, the kind of calm that has teeth hiding behind it. Carla set her bag on the entryway table without breaking stride. The gala ran over. You know how those things are. She moved toward the kitchen, her heels clicking a confident rhythm across the marble. JP didn't move from the window. "Who drove you home, Carla?" The clicking stopped. It was only half a second, barely a breath. But J.P. Min was a man who had built an empire by reading the half seconds other men missed. And in that half second, something shifted in the room. The temperature, the air, the entire architecture of their 3 years together. She turned slowly, her face perfectly arranged. "I took a cab. It was late. I didn't want to bother the driver. I checked the feeds." His voice was still low, still measured. Every camera, every angle, for a 6-block radius. He finally turned from the window, and when his eyes found hers across the room, there was nothing warm in them. "No yellow cab dropped you off tonight, Carla. A black Phantom sedan pulled into the alleyway at 3:02 a.m. You didn't exit from the passenger side." He paused. "You came out of the back." Carla didn't blink, but her jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. JP crossed the room slowly, reaching into his jacket pocket. He held up a small crystal vial between 2 fingers. It caught the light like a jewel. "Bah, and you left this, in the cushion of the couch, right where you sat last Tuesday." Her eyes dropped to the vial for exactly 1 second before snapping back to his face. "That's not perfume," JP said softly. "That's a compound sedative, very specific, very rare. The kind traced directly back to the Russian Bratva's private operations unit." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, stuffed with everything neither of them was saying. Carla's chin lifted another half-inch, and behind those sharp, unreadable eyes, something enormous was being calculated because Carla didn't panic. She never panicked. She strategized. She had always been 3 moves ahead of every room she'd walked into. The question was whether she was 3 moves ahead of him. JP took 1 step closer, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I'm going to ask you one more time." The city hummed 42 floors below. The chandelier flickered once, almost imperceptibly, like even the light was holding its breath. "Who drove you home?" And that is where everything began to unravel, because the answer to that question wasn't a name. It was a war. J.P. Min didn't sleep that night. He sat in his private study, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the city still glittering below him like scattered diamonds on black velvet. 3 monitors cast pale blue light across his face as his tech team pulled every frame of footage from a 6-block radius. And he hadn't touched the glass of whiskey beside him. He hadn't moved in 2 hours. He was thinking. Carla had gone to bed, or at least she'd walked in the direction of the bedroom. Whether she slept was another question entirely. JP had watched her go, watched the way her shoulders carried something heavy, something that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She moved like a woman managing a secret that had gotten too large to hold comfortably. He recognized that walk. He'd seen it on enemies, and he had never expected to see it on her. At 4:47 a.m., his lead analyst flagged something. The Black Phantom sedan's plates were ghost registered, layered through 4 shell companies, each one dissolving into the next like smoke. But the last layer, the deepest one, the one his analyst almost missed. It traced back to a private account JP hadn't seen activated in 18 months. His jaw tightened. Jun-Ho, his younger brother, his second in command. The man who stood at his right hand at every table, every negotiation, every room where power changed hands. The man JP had trusted with the architecture of his entire operation. The man who called him Hyung with what JP had always believed was reverence. He stared at the name on the screen for a long time without blinking. But then something else caught his eye, something his analyst had flagged as a secondary detail, the kind of loose thread most men would ignore. The shell company at the outermost registration layer had a name, 47 Holdings. JP stared at that name and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with Jun-Ho. 47 was Jackson's prison number, Jackson, Carla's brother. The man JP had been told died in a holding facility 6 years ago while awaiting transfer. The man whose death certificate JP had signed off on without reading past the first line because Jun-Ho had placed it in front of him during the most chaotic quarter the organization had ever survived. And JP, for the first and only time in his career, had trusted his brother to handle the details. He sat very still, with that realization settling through him like ice water. Jun-Ho had handled the details. He rose from the desk slowly, rolling his sleeves down, buttoning each cuff with deliberate precision. He walked to the bedroom doorway and stood there in the dark, watching the shape of Carla beneath the covers. Her natural hair was spread against the white pillow, her red-tipped fingers curled loosely near her face. Even in sleep there was a guardedness to her, a tension in the line of her jaw, a slight furrow between her brows, like even her dreams required strategy. She wasn't at peace. She was surviving. And JP, standing in the dark doorway, you understood for the first time that she had been surviving something far older and far deeper than him. He turned and walked back to his desk. He had a brother to watch, and he had until dawn to decide how many lies Jun-Ho had buried and how deep. She was awake before the sun. Carla sat at the edge of the bed in the gray pre-dawn stillness, her red dress exchanged for one of JP's white dress shirts, the fabric swallowing her frame, the hem falling mid-thigh. She hadn't slept, not really. She'd lain in that enormous bed with her eyes closed and her mind running calculations at full speed, every possible version of tomorrow mapped and stress-tested until none of them felt safe. She heard him before she saw him, the quiet click of the study door, footsteps that were controlled, measured, deliberate. JP never shuffled, never dragged his feet, never moved without intention. She straightened instinctively, lifting her chin, arranging her expression into something unreadable. And it was muscle memory by now. 3 years of loving a man who operated at a frequency most people couldn't detect had sharpened her in ways she hadn't anticipated when she first walked into his life. He appeared in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He looked at her the way you look at something you're not sure you still recognize, searching, careful, the warmth that usually lived somewhere beneath his composure pulled back behind something colder. "Show me your wrists," he said. Carla's breath caught, just barely. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds before she extended her arms, slowly pushing the loose sleeves of his shirt back to the elbow. The bruising was pale but present, a ring of pressure marks around each wrist, the kind that come from hands gripping too hard, holding too long, refusing to let go. JP crossed the room in 4 strides. He took her wrists in both hands, not roughly, but with a certainty that made the air between them feel like a held note. His thumbs moved across the bruising slowly, and his face did something complicated, something that moved through fury and landed somewhere that looked almost like anguish. "Who did this?" It wasn't a question. Carla looked up at him, and in that moment she made a decision, the kind you can't walk back from. "JP." Her voice was quiet, steady. "I need you to hear what I'm about to tell you and not react. I need you to just listen." His jaw tightened, but he didn't move, didn't release her wrists. "My name," she said, "is Carla Miller." The silence that followed was absolute. JP's hands stilled. Miller. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved across his face in slow, devastating waves. Judge Miller, The man JP had spent 4 years cultivating, bribing, leveraging. This was the man who had quietly buried 3 federal cases that should have ended JP's operation before it reached its current scale. The man JP believed he owned completely. "He's your father," JP said. "He sent me to get close to you." Carla held his gaze without flinching. 3 years ago, he wanted leverage. He wanted something on you that the bribes couldn't cover, something personal, something that would put him above you instead of in your pocket. She paused. "He didn't expect me to stay." "But you stayed." "I stayed." The weight of those 2 words filled the room completely. JP searched her face with the focused intensity of a man who had made his fortune reading people, detecting the hairline fractures between truth and performance. And what he found in her eyes wasn't guilt. It was grief. She had stayed. She had chosen him over her father's mission, over her own extraction, like over every rational instinct that should have sent her walking out that door 18 months ago. And now she was here, bruised, exposed, stripped of every layer of cover, telling him the truth because she had run out of any other play. JP released her wrists slowly. He stepped back. And the look on his face in that moment, unguarded, raw, the walls down for just one breath, told her everything she needed to know about how deeply she had already changed him. Then he said something she didn't expect. "Does the name 47 Holdings mean anything to you?" Carla's entire body went still, not the practiced stillness of a woman managing her expression, something deeper, something involuntary, the stillness of a person who has just heard a ghost speak. Her eyes searched his face. "Where did you hear that?" "The Sedan," JP said. "The outermost shell company." He watched her carefully. "It was your brother's prison number." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Carla stood in the gray morning light with JP's shirt hanging off her shoulders, and something enormous moving behind her eyes, something she had kept sealed for 6 years, cracking open along a seam she hadn't known still existed. "Jackson is dead," she said. And even as she said it, her voice carried the particular hollowness of someone reciting something they had never fully believed. "I know what Jun-Ho's report said," JP replied quietly. "I'm asking what you believe." She looked at him for a long time. She didn't answer, and that silence told JP Min everything he needed to know. "The vial," JP said. "Explain it." They were in the kitchen now. Carla had made coffee, not from nervousness but from necessity, from the need to have something to do with her hands while she navigated the most dangerous conversation of her life. The penthouse was beginning to catch the earliest edge of morning light, gold seeping in at the margins, softening the hard lines of chrome and marble. JP stood on the opposite side of the island, the crystal vial placed between them on the countertop like evidence at a trial. Carla wrapped both hands around her mug and met his eyes directly. "I've been putting it in your drink, once a week. Small doses, nothing that would harm you. Just enough to make you feel off. Tired? Not yourself." The silence that followed had a texture to it. JP's expression didn't shift, but something behind his eyes went very still, the stillness of a man processing information that is simultaneously infuriating and revelatory. "You've been drugging me. I've been keeping you home." She set the mug down. 3 weeks ago, you were supposed to attend the midnight summit at the Meridian, the private meeting between your top lieutenants and the Eastern distribution heads. She held his gaze. That meeting was a setup. There was an arranged plan to have you removed quietly, cleanly, in a room full of men who would all swear you never arrived. A beat of silence. Someone inside your organization arranged for you to walk into that room and never walk out. She paused. "I found out 4 days before it was scheduled. I didn't have time to identify who, and I didn't have proof you'd believe. So I made you sick." JP stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the vial. "You compromised my body to protect my life." "I made a choice," Carla said. "I'd make it again." The weight of that settled over the kitchen like something heavy and warm, complicated in the way that only real things are complicated, where right and wrong don't sit cleanly on opposite sides of a line. What JP had spent a decade being the most dangerous man in any room he entered. He had not, in 11 years, been protected by anyone. The unfamiliarity of it moved through him strangely. He picked up the vial, turned it once between his fingers. Then he set it back down and looked at her. Really looked at her, and what passed across his face was something that had no name in the language of the world he operated in. "Who was it?" he said quietly. "Who arranged the summit?" Carla's jaw shifted. "I don't have a confirmed name, but I have a suspicion." "Tell me." She hesitated, and that hesitation was its own answer, because Carla did not hesitate without reason. She was measuring something, calculating the cost of the next sentence. "I think," she said carefully, "that you already know." And in the charged silence that followed, something changed in JP's eyes. A door closing, a conclusion arriving. The name assembling itself in the architecture of his mind until it stood fully formed and undeniable. He didn't say it aloud. He didn't need to. He walked to the cabinet, poured 2 glasses of water, and set one in front of her. Then he picked up his own glass, looked at it for a moment, and drank. It was the smallest possible gesture, barely anything at all, but Carla understood it immediately, and something in her chest loosened for the first time in weeks. He was choosing to trust her. Mick for now. What neither of them knew yet was that Jun-Ho had been watching the kitchen feed from a remote terminal for the past 20 minutes, that he had heard every word, that he was already moving, and that the real attack had not yet begun. The car was still there. JP's tech lead sent the alert at 6:23 a.m. The black Phantom sedan had not moved from the alleyway below the building. It sat at the far edge of the camera's frame, engine off, no visible occupant, utterly still in the pale early morning, like something left behind deliberately, like a message. JP pulled the live feed onto his phone and studied it while Carla stood at the window, looking down at the street 42 floors below. She'd changed into dark trousers and a fitted black turtleneck, her natural hair pinned back now, her face composed into the kind of focused calm that JP had come to recognize as her operational mode, the version of her that didn't feel, or at least didn't show it. "Your team can't access the registration," JP said. "They won't be able to," Carla said quietly. "I already know why." JP looked up from the phone. She turned from the window to face him. "That car is registered to a holding company that was dissolved 10 years ago." She paused. "It belonged to your father." The phone lowered slowly in JP's hand. His father, Sung-Jin Min, had died 11 years ago. An apparently natural death that JP had long suspected was anything but, though he had never been able to prove it. Sung-Jin's accounts, his companies, his entire financial infrastructure had been dismantled and redistributed in the years following his death, or so JP had believed. "Someone has been maintaining those accounts," Carla said, "keeping them active beneath the surface, moving small amounts through them, just enough to keep the structure alive, and not enough to trigger any flags." Her eyes held his steadily. "Someone who knew your father's operation from the inside." JP set his phone on the desk. He walked to the window and stood beside her, looking down at the alleyway. The sedan sat there in the gray morning light, patient and still. "Pull up the car's interior feed," he said into his earpiece. A pause. Then his analyst's voice. "Sir, the interior camera is active, but the car is empty. No driver, no passenger." Another pause, way shorter. "It's been running on automated navigation since it left the gala. A self-driving car, a ghost vehicle, operated through dead accounts, moving through the city like something that wasn't supposed to exist." JP was quiet for a long moment. Then the analyst spoke again, and his voice had changed, tightened with something that sounded close to unease. "Sir, there's something on the back seat. The interior camera is showing a white lily." The words landed in the room like a cold hand placed at the back of the neck. JP went completely still. White lilies, his mother's funeral. 30 years ago, he had stood beside his father in a church full of white lilies while his mother was lowered into the ground, and Sung-Jin Min had gripped his small hand so tightly it left marks. JP had never been able to look at white lilies since. No one knew that. No one living, or so he had believed. Carla was watching him. She saw the shift in his expression, subtle, deep, the kind of crack that appears in things built to last, and she reached out without thinking and placed her hand over his where it rested against the glass. He didn't pull away. "JP." Her voice was low. Someone isn't just using your father's accounts. Someone is sending you a message. They know who you are beneath all of this. She pressed slightly. They know what you lost. Only one person outside my bloodline ever knew about those lilies, JP said quietly. His eyes stayed on the sedan below. I told him once, years ago, late night, too much whiskey, the kind of conversation you don't remember having until something drags it back up. Carla waited. I told Jackson, he said. The silence between them stretched thin as wire. Carla's hand tightened over his. Neither of them spoke the implication aloud. But it was there, fully formed. Look impossible to ignore. The sedan, the Lily, the shell company named after a prison number, the death certificate JP had signed without reading. Jackson Miller was not dead. He had been leaving a trail. And he had been leaving it specifically for JP to find. His hand turned slowly beneath hers, fingers closing around her palm, not gently, not roughly, but with the particular grip of a man holding onto the one thing in the room he was still certain of. The past was not dead. It was parked in the alleyway, and it was about to walk through the front door. The elevator arrived without being called. That was the first wrong thing. JP heard it before his security team flagged it, the soft mechanical hum, the almost imperceptible shift in air pressure that came with the car ascending. He was already moving before the alert hit his earpiece, one hand finding Carla's arm, steering her back from the window with a quiet authority that brooked no argument. She didn't argue. She moved. That was the thing about Carla that most people never got to see. Beneath the composure, beneath the strategy and the careful positioning, she was fast. Her mind processed threat before her body fully registered it, and when JP's hand closed around her arm and redirected her, she was already scanning the room, already calculating exits, already 3 seconds ahead of the moment. They were alike, in ways that should have been impossible. The elevator doors opened. Jun-Ho stepped out alone, which was somehow more alarming than if he'd brought an army. He was dressed impeccably, dark suit, no tie, the kind of effortless presentation that announced a man who had nothing to prove. He was younger than JP by 4 years, sharper in the face, with their father's jaw and none of their father's patience. He carried a tablet loosely at his side and wore an expression of mild amusement that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes, when they found Carla, it were something else entirely. "Brother," he said pleasantly, "I see she made it home safely." JP didn't move. "You want to tell me why your name is attached to the sedan?" Jun-Ho smiled, small, controlled, the smile of a man who has rehearsed this conversation. "I want to tell you a great many things, but first..." His gaze shifted to Carla, and something passed across his face that was possessive in a way that made the air in the room change. "I think she should leave." "She stays," JP said. The smile didn't waver. "JP, what I'm about to show you changes the structure of everything you think you've built, and it begins with her." He raised the tablet. On the screen was a photograph, surveillance quality, taken from a distance. Carla standing outside a federal building, alone, 18 months ago. She met with the FBI 4 times before she ever met you. The room went absolutely silent. Carla didn't flinch. She didn't look at JP. She kept her eyes on Jun-Ho with the focused, unblinking attention of someone who has just identified the most dangerous thing in the room. 4 meetings, Jun-Ho continued, his voice dropping into something almost gentle, the tone of a man who enjoys delivering damage slowly. Her handler was an agent named Reeves. The operation was called Silk Road North. The target, he paused, letting it land, was you. JP turned to look at Carla, and what he saw on her face was not guilt. It was not panic. It was something far more complex, a grief so deep and so old it had calcified into something that looked almost like resolve. She met his gaze directly, and in her eyes was the answer to a question he hadn't yet finished asking. She had been sent to destroy him. She had chosen to protect him instead. Jun-Ho believed this revelation was his weapon. He had been saving it, sharpening it, waiting for precisely the right moment to drive it between them. He had calculated that JP's pride would do the rest, that the disclosure would detonate their partnership from within and leave Jun-Ho standing in the wreckage as the only loyal party remaining. What Jun-Ho had not calculated was Carla. She crossed the room slowly, picked up JP's phone from the desk, and turned the screen to face Jun-Ho. On it was a financial transfer log, 8 transactions, and each routed through the same ghost infrastructure as the Phantom Sedan. "What's interesting," she said quietly, "is that these transfers, which you flagged as a breach in our C operations, they originate from your private account, not an outside actor, not the Russians, not the FBI." She stopped 3 feet from him. "You." Jun-Ho looked at the screen. Then he did something neither JP nor Carla anticipated. He laughed. It was a short sound, almost appreciative. The laugh of a man who has just watched a good move on a chessboard and is genuinely impressed despite himself. He set the tablet down on the console and clasped his hands in front of him. And when he looked up, the pleasantness was entirely gone, replaced by something that had always been underneath it, something patient and cold and absolutely convinced of its own superiority. "You think that's enough," he said. 8 transactions. He tilted his head. "JP, tell me, where is your operations chief right now?" JP's eyes didn't move from his brother's face. "Sector security," Jun-Ho continued. "Your harbor liaisons, the 3 men who control access to your primary accounts." He paused, and the pause was deliberate and surgical. "I didn't come here to fight you, Hyung. I came here because I've already won. Everything you're holding on that phone is evidence of a version of events I've already rewritten. By the time any authority looks at those transfers, the documentation will show they originated from a flagged account inside Carla's network." He smiled again, thin and precise. "I've had 18 months to build the alternate narrative. You've had 1 night." The room shifted. Not visibly. Not in any way that someone watching from outside would have detected. But JP felt it, the sudden awareness that the ground beneath his positioning was less solid than he had believed 30 seconds ago. Jun-Ho had not come unprepared. He'd come with a counter-architecture, a parallel version of events constructed over a year and a half, and JP was only now understanding the full dimensions of what his brother had built while standing at his right hand and calling him Hyung. This was not a man who had overreached. This was a man who had been methodical. Carla's voice cut through the silence before JP could respond. "The operations chief is in federal custody," she said. As of 40 minutes ago. Jun-Ho turned to look at her. "Your harbor liaisons were intercepted at the Verrazzano this morning," she continued, her voice even and unhurried, each word placed with the precision of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment. "The 3 men controlling your account access have been isolated from all external communication since 5 a.m. And the alternate documentation you spent 18 months building." She reached into her own jacket and produced a drive, small and black, holding it up between 2 fingers. "Was copied from your private server 11 days ago. We've had your rewritten narrative the entire time." The silence that followed was a different quality than any that had come before it. Jun-Ho stared at the drive. "You've been watching me build my own trap," he said quietly. "We've been watching you build your own trap," Carla confirmed. Jun-Ho looked at his brother, and JP, who had not moved, who had stood through the entirety of Jun-Ho's gambit with his hands at his sides and his face completely still, finally spoke. "You made one mistake," JP said. "The same mistake everyone makes." He paused. "You looked at what was in front of you and decided you understood what I valued. You decided the organization was the thing I would protect at any cost." His eyes moved to Carla for just a moment, brief and unguarded, and then back to his brother. "You were wrong." Jun-Ho's jaw tightened, and then something happened that none of them had planned for. The service entrance door opened, and Jackson Miller walked in. He was leaner than the photographs Carla had kept, the ones she'd hidden inside a book she never put on any shelf JP could see. Older in the face, with 6 years of something unnameable living behind his eyes. He wore plain dark clothes and moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who had spent years making himself invisible. But when his eyes found his sister across the room, everything careful in him broke open for just one moment, one single unguarded moment, before he pulled it back. Carla didn't move. She stood completely still, and her stillness was nothing like the composed, strategic stillness JP had spent 3 years learning to read. This was something else. This was the stillness of a person whose body has stopped processing everything except the single fact in front of it. Her brother was alive. He was standing 10 feet away from her. And he was alive. Carla. Jackson's voice was low, roughened by 6 years of a life she hadn't been part of. He took one step toward her and stopped, like he understood she needed the distance. It was like he knew her well enough to know she would close it herself when she was ready. She crossed the room. She didn't run. She walked, and the walking was deliberate, each step carrying the weight of 6 years of grief being dismantled in real time. And when she reached him, she put both hands flat against his chest, not embracing him yet, just feeling that he was solid, that he was real, that the fact of him was not something her mind had constructed out of desperate wanting. Jackson covered her hands with both of his and held them there. "You kept the apartment on Lenox," he said quietly. Just that. 4 words that meant nothing to anyone else in the room and everything to her, a reference to something shared and specific and impossibly private, the kind of detail that could only come from someone who had really been there, who had really known her before any of this. Carla closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were dry. But something in her face had changed permanently. Some tension that had lived there so long it had become structural finally released. And what replaced it was something rawer and more human than anything JP had seen on her in 3 years. Jackson looked over his sister's head at JP. "You signed the certificate," he said, not accusatory, just true. "I did," JP said. "I won't make a case for why. It was a failure I own." Jackson held his gaze for a long moment, measuring. The way men measure each other when the stakes are real and words are insufficient. Then he looked at Jun-Ho, and what lived in that look was 6 years of a very specific and very patient fury. Jun-Ho, for the first time since stepping off that elevator, had nothing to say. JP pressed a single button on his phone. 2 of his most senior men appeared from the service entrance, positions they had held for the past 3 hours, waiting. They stood quietly on either side of the room without drama, without theater, simply present in the way that made their purpose entirely clear. Jun-Ho looked at them, then at Jackson, then at Carla, who had turned to face him with her brother's hand still holding hers, and the look on her face was not triumph. It was something quieter and more final than triumph. It was the look of a woman who has paid every price and is simply done. He looked at JP last, and something passed between the brothers that was too old and too complicated to name. Was it the residue of a shared childhood, a shared father, a shared table, 34 years of a bond that had just been irrevocably broken by the man who claimed to have loved it most? Jun-Ho straightened his jacket. He walked into the elevator without another word. The doors closed, and the penthouse went quiet. The quiet lasted longer than anyone filled it. JP stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and said nothing. Jackson moved to the far window and stood there looking out at the city, giving the room space to breathe. Carla stood where she had been when the elevator closed, her arms loose at her sides, her face turned slightly away from JP in a way that was not evasion. It was the posture of a person processing too many things at once to manage any of them cleanly. The morning light had fully arrived, gold and indifferent, illuminating everything it touched. JP walked to the kitchen. He poured 3 glasses of water and set them on the island. He straightened one of them that didn't need straightening. He looked at the countertop for a moment. Then he walked back into the main room and stood at a distance from Carla that was close enough to be intentional and far enough to be respectful, and he said nothing for a long time. She didn't look at him. He didn't rush her. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless motion, 42 floors below. It's entirely uninterested in what was happening in the room above it. A siren somewhere, a horn, the ordinary noise of a city that had not paused for any of this. JP looked at Carla's profile, the line of her jaw, the way she held the weight of the morning in her shoulders, the bruise at her jaw that he had not yet allowed himself to fully look at. The wrists he had held in his hands a few hours ago, the marks on them that his brother had put there, using her as a lever against a man who had not yet understood what she was worth. He had understood now. "I'm sorry," he said. She turned to look at him. "For what was done in my name," he said. For the certificate I signed without reading, for 6 years of a grief you carried that I could have prevented if I had been paying the kind of attention I owed the people in my orbit." He held her gaze, and there was nothing managed in his expression, no composure deployed as armor. Just the plain difficult fact of a man saying something true at the cost of everything he had built his identity around. For every moment you stood in this penthouse carrying information that could have destroyed you and chose over and over to protect something that had not yet earned that protection. He paused. "I am sorry, Carla, not as a transaction, not because it is strategically sound, because it is true and you deserve to hear it before now." Carla looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Jackson, who was watching from the window with an expression that was still measuring but had shifted, slightly, toward something that might in time become something warmer. She looked back at JP. "You realize," she said quietly, "that what comes next requires you to trust me completely, not situationally, not when the evidence supports it." Her eyes held his steadily. "Completely." "I know," JP said. "You've never trusted anyone completely." "No," he said. "I haven't." The space between that admission and whatever came next was enormous, and neither of them rushed it. Then Carla reached out and straightened his jacket collar with both hands, a gesture so quiet and so specific in the middle of everything that had just happened that it landed like the closing of a very long chapter. Not an ending. A turn of the page. "Then we'd better learn how," she said. They stood on the pedestrian bridge over the East River as the sun came fully up, and the city spreading out before them in the light of a morning that had survived a brutal night. JP stood at the railing, jacket gone for the first time in recent memory. Carla stood beside him, close enough that their arms touched. She was not unharmed. The bruise at her jaw had deepened in the hours since the confrontation. Her wrists still ached. She had not slept in over 24 hours, and the cost of that was written into her body in ways she was not trying to hide. But JP had noticed all of it and said nothing, because saying nothing was sometimes the most honest response available. Jackson stood a few feet away, giving them the distance they needed, his forearms on the railing, his eyes on the water. He would need time. They all would. There were debts in this story that a single morning could not settle, structures to dismantle, a brother who would face consequences that JP had not yet allowed himself to fully grieve, and a judge named Miller who still believed his daughter was his instrument. None of that was resolved. None of it was clean. "What now?" Carla asked. JP was quiet for a moment. The river moved below them, dark and indifferent and continuous. "We rebuild," he said, "but differently. Everything accounted for. Everyone at the table earning their share." He paused. "And your father." Carla glanced at him. "He sent you to gather evidence," JP said. "He has it. Why, 3 years of proximity to my operation filtered through you." He looked at the water. "Which means he has leverage he believes is absolute." "He does believe that," Carla said carefully. "He's wrong," JP said, "because what he doesn't know is that the evidence he thinks he holds has been deliberately shaped for the past 14 months. Every piece of information that reached him through your access came through a filter. What he has is a portrait of an operation that no longer exists, and never existed in the form he believes it did." He paused. "Jackson built the filter." Carla turned to look at her brother. Jackson didn't turn around, but the line of his shoulders shifted slightly with something that in another life might have been satisfaction. Carla looked back at JP with an expression he had never seen on her before, not in 3 years of watching her face in every light. It was something unguarded and enormous and entirely without strategy. JP reached over and took her hand on the railing, not to claim it, not to command it, just to hold it. The sun came fully up over Manhattan and found them there, two people who had outmaneuvered everything, who had survived each other and the wreckage of what other people tried to make them, who had chosen each other not in a moment of passion, but in the slow, deliberate way that real choices are made, over and over. At cost, in the dark, without guarantee. The empire was damaged. Several of its walls would have to come down. There were consequences still arriving and griefs not yet fully felt. But the woman beside him had spent 3 years choosing him when every rational calculation said otherwise, and she was still here, bruised and exhausted and entirely unbroken, watching the sun come up over a city they were about to remake. J.P. Min, who had built everything he owned on the principle that nothing soft survives, stood in the morning light holding her hand, and revised everything he had ever believed about what it meant to be strong. The empire was waiting. It had a different shape than it did yesterday, and this time he would not build it alone. If this story held you from that first question to this bridge, you already know what to do. Hit that like button and subscribe, because part 2 is coming, and what JP and Carla face next will make everything you just watched look like the opening move. Drop your city in the comments right now. This story has traveled further than you know, and I want to see exactly where it landed. Tell me, did you see Jackson coming from the White Lily, or did that catch you off guard? Comment I saw it or you got me and let us find out who was really paying attention. Part 2 is coming. See you there.